Before a castle wall could be taken, someone had to climb first. A soldier at the bottom of the ladder knew he was the easiest target: stones, arrows, even boiling sand waiting above. Yet, in medieval armies, men volunteered for that role. Why? Would anyone step forward to climb first? Tonight, we'll follow their footsteps through mud, ladders, and silence, to uncover the forgotten reasons behind one of the most dangerous jobs in history, and why it mattered more than you might think. Section 1. The ladder against the wall. When you imagine a medieval battle, you might think of knights on horseback, shining armor in the sunlight, banners fluttering in the wind, and the clash of steel against steel. But the truth is far less glamorous, and for many soldiers, the most dangerous task of all came not in open battle, but in the desperate, grinding work of a siege. Sieges were the defining feature of medieval warfare. Castles with their high stone walls were designed to resist raiders, knights, and entire armies. If an enemy wished to take one, they had two choices: starve the defenders out, or scale the walls. Starving a garrison could take months, even years, and armies often didn't have that kind of time. Which meant that more often than not, someone had to climb a ladder while arrows, stones, and boiling oil rained down from above. Here is where the puzzle begins. Who would take the first step? The ladder as a symbol, the siege ladder was not a complicated machine. Unlike great siege engines like trebuchets or battering rams, a ladder was a simple wooden structure, not too different from the ones you might see in a modern workshop or orchard. Yet in the Middle Ages, this humble tool took on a symbolic power. To climb it was to face near certain death, for the defenders knew exactly where to aim their arrows and pour their boiling water. And yet, men volunteered for the task. Chroniclers. From England to Byzantium, from the Crusader states to the castles of France, tell us that there were always those who pushed forward, eager to be first up the ladder. Why? Honor and glory. In the medieval mindset, honor was worth more than life. For a knight, the promise of renown was powerful. To be remembered as the man who placed the first foot on the wall meant songs might be sung, chronicles might record your name, and lords might reward you with land or wealth. But this wasn't just true for knights. Common soldiers, too, understood that volunteering could bring rewards. Medieval lords often promised money, plunder, or advancement to those who distinguished themselves. A peasant who carried the ladder and climbed first might not live long, but if he did, his future could change, and beyond earthly rewards, there was the spiritual. For Christian warriors in particular, death in battle, especially against so-called infidels during the Crusades, was framed as a path to salvation. To climb the ladder was to risk everything, but also to reach for eternal life. Practical necessity. There is another explanation, less romantic but perhaps more convincing. Sometimes, men volunteered because they had no choice. Medieval armies often conscripted soldiers from villages or mercenary companies, and commanders demanded men for dangerous jobs. To refuse was shameful, perhaps even punishable. Volunteering might have been a way to embrace a fate that was otherwise inevitable. And then there was the tactical reality. Not all who climbed first were meant to survive. The first wave often drew enemy fire, clearing the way for those behind. It was a grim calculation, but one armies understood well. Sacrifice a few, and the rest might succeed. A world of sieges. To understand why siege ladders mattered so much, you have to picture medieval Europe, or the Middle East, as it was. Towns were walled, castles dotted the landscape. Even monasteries and wealthy manors built defensive walls. Travel along a medieval road, and you would see towers on hilltops, keeps by rivers, and fortress walls rising over towns. Warfare was less about open field battles and more about breaking into these fortified places. The latter was often the simplest tool to try. Siege towers took weeks to build, requiring carpenters, oxen, and time. Battering rams demanded heavy timber and cover from missile fire. But ladders could be made quickly from local wood and carried by hand. They might break, they might burn, but they could be built again. This simplicity gave them a strange power. Whenever an army needed to storm a wall, ladders were the first resort, which meant there was always the question, who climbs first? The experience of climbing, it is one thing to imagine and another to picture yourself there. The ladder is placed against the wall. It wobbles as men brace it at the base. Arrows whistle past. The defenders shout insults. Stones crash down, sometimes breaking bones before a man takes 3 steps upward. The first climber feels the ladder shake beneath his feet, not just from his own weight, but from those behind him, eager to climb as well. He grips the wood, slippery with rain or blood, and keeps going upward. Near the top, the danger multiplies. A hand might reach over the battlement to push him back. A spear might thrust down. Or worse, boiling water or oil could scald him, forcing him to fall. And yet, some made it over, pulling themselves onto the parapet and fighting desperately to create space for others. The climb itself could last only seconds, but those seconds stretched into eternity for the man who lived them. The forgotten names, chroniclers occasionally record the names of these first climbers. At Acre, during the Crusades, one man was celebrated for climbing a ladder alone, despite arrows piercing his armor. At the siege of Jerusalem, men fought bitterly to be first over the walls, knowing that priests promised heaven itself to those who fell. But for every name remembered, thousands are lost. The ordinary soldier whose ladder broke or whose body fell into the ditch below was rarely recorded. The silence of history hides them, though without them, no siege could succeed. An unresolved question, as you picture these ladders, leaning against stone walls in the dust and smoke of battle. The question lingers, did these men climb out of bravery or out of necessity? Did they truly seek honor, or was it simply a duty no one could refuse? And more importantly, what awaited them at the top of that ladder on the other side of the wall? Chapter 2. Choosing the first to climb. In the previous section, you followed the ladder up toward the battlements, step by perilous step, and stood at the edge of that question, who would be first to climb? The answer was never simple. It depended on the army, the commander, the culture, and the moment. Sometimes it was honor, sometimes coercion, sometimes the promise of reward. But no matter how it happened, the choice of who carried the ladder forward shaped the course of every siege, recruitment, and selection. When a medieval army prepared for an assault, commanders needed more than just numbers. They needed courage, or at least obedience. Chronicles suggest that soldiers were often chosen in advance to form what were known as forlorn hopes. This phrase, later popular in early modern warfare, describes groups of men sent on near-suicidal missions. A commander might gather his soldiers, ask for volunteers, and then stand silently as men stepped forward. There is evidence from English and French armies that lords would sometimes point to individuals, naming them for the task, leaving little room for refusal. In some cases, mercenary companies had traditions of drawing lots. It was not always the strongest or the most eager who climbed, but those who found themselves bound by duty or chance, and yet many did volunteer. In the heat of camp life, under the watchful gaze of peers, volunteering for the ladder could carry its own pressure. Few men wanted to be known as cowards, promises and rewards. What made volunteering bearable were the promises attached. Medieval chronicles repeatedly note that the first man on the wall, if he survived, would receive tangible rewards. A knight might be promised land or a place at his lord's table. A common soldier might be offered coin, armor, or even the right to plunder. First, once the city fell, in some regions, there were specific customs. In Italy, mercenary captains known as condottieri often promised double pay to the first soldiers who breached walls. In the Crusader states, papal indulgences, promises of forgiveness of sins, were extended to those who died in such assaults. The incentive was not only material but eternal. The rewards extended beyond the individual. Families might benefit as well. A fallen man's widow could receive extra land or exemption from certain taxes. The act of climbing first was framed not only as personal bravery, but as a sacrifice for family and community. Cultural contexts. Knights, mercenaries, and peasants. The motivations varied across cultures. For knights of Western Europe, honor and reputation were paramount. A knight who climbed first would be remembered, perhaps even knighted on the spot if he was not already. Chronicles often describe these moments as tests of chivalry. For mercenaries, it was a business decision. Companies of soldiers for hire saw volunteering as part of their contract. Risk was calculated against reward. Some mercenary groups had reputations for reckless bravery, deliberately fostering the image that they could storm walls where others faltered. For peasant conscripts, however, the choice was more constrained. They were often the ones forced into carrying ladders, their role shaped less by honor and more by necessity. While a knight could weigh prestige and a mercenary could count pay, the peasant was often swept into the current of command. Still, chronicles occasionally show that even among peasants, individuals rose to fame for surprising acts of courage. Rituals before the assault. Before ladders were raised, armies often performed rituals. Priests blessed the soldiers, sprinkling holy water on the ladders themselves. In Islamic armies, imams led prayers, promising paradise for those who died storming walls. These ceremonies reinforced the idea that climbing first was not merely an act of war, but a sacred duty. Some commanders encouraged competition. Chronicles from the Crusades mention rivalries between knights of different regions, Normans, Flemings, and Provencals, each eager to prove they would be first to mount the walls. In Byzantine armies, where discipline was stricter, climbing first was more carefully assigned, often to professional soldiers or imperial guards. The ladder in this context became more than wood and nails. It became a stage upon which courage, piety, and ambition were displayed. The calculated sacrifice. One of the most sobering realities of siege warfare is that the first climbers were rarely expected to succeed. Their role was to absorb the defenders. Fury, drawing arrows, rocks, and boiling oil while others climbed behind. Commanders calculated these losses. A few dozen men might die, but their deaths might allow hundreds to reach the top. In this way, the ladder's first climbers were both volunteers and sacrifices. It is a reminder that warfare was not only about individual bravery, but about cold arithmetic. This practice was not unique to Europe. In Song Dynasty China, records describe soldiers carrying ladders under heavy fire from city walls, using large shields to cover their heads. In Japan, during the Sengoku period, ladder assaults were common, and the first climbers, often ashigaru foot soldiers, were promised stipends or recognition if they survived. Across cultures, the principle was the same: sacrifice the few to open the way for the many. The view from above and below. Imagine standing at the base of the wall as a commander. You have ordered the ladders forward. Men brace them against the stone, and you watch as the first climb. Some fall immediately. Others reach the top, only to be struck down. Behind them, more ascend. Each step a gamble between life and death. Now, imagine standing on the wall as a defender. You see the enemy ladders rising, men clambering upward. You hurl stones, thrust spears downward, or tip cauldrons of scalding water. You know that stopping the first climbers is crucial. If they gain a foothold, the wall may be lost. From above and below, the first climber is both threat and victim, the focal point of all attention, remembered in chronicle and song. Some of these men were remembered. At the siege of Antioch in 1098, Bohemond's chroniclers recorded the names of knights who first mounted the ladders. At the siege of Chateau Galliard in France, chroniclers describe how attackers climbed ladders into latrine chutes to gain entry, a humiliating but effective method. remembered with both disgust and admiration. In Icelandic sagas, stories of Viking raiders scaling walls appear, though often with the exaggeration of legend. In Arabic chronicles, the bravery of individual soldiers in storming crusader fortresses is praised in poetic terms. The names of these first climbers echo faintly across languages and centuries, though countless others remain unrecorded. Their memory reveals something important. Societies valued and celebrated the act of climbing first, not only as a practical necessity, but as a moral and cultural ideal. The shadows of cowardice, yet behind the celebration lay its opposite, shame. To refuse the latter when called was dishonorable. Chronicles occasionally record accusations of cowardice against soldiers or knights who hung back. In the tightly woven web of medieval honor, failing to climb when expected could ruin reputations. This social pressure ensured that even those reluctant still moved forward. The ladder, therefore, was not only a path upward, but a test one that few could afford to fail publicly, an unresolved thought. So when we ask, why did men volunteer to climb siege ladders first? The answers multiply. They volunteered for glory, for pay, for faith, for family, for community, or because they had no choice at all. But beneath all of these reasons lies a deeper truth. Armies needed them too. Without the first climbers, a siege might drag on indefinitely, resources might run dry, and an army might collapse. The entire rhythm of medieval warfare depended on this act of sacrifice, which leaves us with the lingering question, for those few who survived the climb and lived. To stand atop the wall, what happened next? Did they find honor, or only more danger waiting beyond the battlements? Chapter 3. Standing on the wall, the ladder creaks beneath your boots. You are no longer at the base, staring upward, but near the top. The wall rises above you, defenders shouting and striking downward. An arrow hums past your ear. A stone crashes against the ladder, sending the man below tumbling back. You keep climbing, heart pounding, until your hand closes on the battlement's edge. For the first climber, this was the moment of truth, not honor abstractly promised, not fear half imagined, but the reality of standing eye to eye with the enemy. What awaited those who survived the climb was not relief, but the most dangerous struggle of all, holding the wall until more men could follow, the first foot on stone, medieval. Chronicles often describe this instant with dramatic attention. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, a few knights were said to have leapt over the battlements even before others reached the top, fighting alone against defenders until reinforcements arrived. At other sieges, the first climbers used hooks or ropes to haul themselves onto narrow ledges, desperately trying to hold a position only wide enough for a few feet. The first man to place his foot on the enemy's wall was both hero and target. Defenders knew that pushing him back could collapse the assault. Attackers knew that if he fell, morale below might falter. In this fragile balance, seconds mattered. A spear thrust, a stone hurled, a shield raised. It could all determine whether the ladder was a step toward victory or a grave. The brutality of close combat, fighting atop the walls, was unlike open battlefields. Space was limited, footing uncertain, and weapons clashed in brutal proximity. Defenders wielded polearms, pikes, and long spears to thrust downward. Attackers carried swords, axes, or short spears, anything maneuverable in cramped quarters. There was also the constant risk of being pushed back. A man might stand firm against 3 strikes, only to stumble on loose stone and fall backward, crushing those climbing below. Accounts from the 100 Years' War describe how ladders snapped under the combined weight of men and stone missiles, sending dozens tumbling in tangled heaps. The first climbers often fought alone or in pairs, until the second wave arrived. Their survival depended on buying just enough time for others to crest the wall beside them, holding the breach. If enough attackers reached the top, the balance shifted. A ladder that delivered one man was easily defended against. A ladder that delivered 20 could overwhelm a section of wall. Chronicles emphasize how narrow the margins often were. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, Christian attackers reportedly secured the wall only after repeated assaults in which the first climbers were slain, forcing replacements again and again until finally a foothold was won. The duty of the first climbers, then, was not to win the siege outright, but to open the door for those behind. They were the hinge upon which the fate of thousands turned: survivors, rewards, and honors. On the rare occasions when the first climbers survived, they could reap rewards. Some were knighted immediately on the battlefield, their bravery recognized in front of their peers. Others received grants of land in the conquered city or exemptions from taxes. In England, royal records sometimes note rewards for the first over the wall, granting them annuities or pensions. In Italian mercenary companies, surviving climbers were honored with banners or distinctive badges. These tokens marked them as men who had literally stood first where others hesitated, but survival was rare. Many names remembered in chronicles are those of the dead, celebrated as martyrs of bravery. The fallen, bodies at the base of the wall. For every survivor, dozens fell. Their bodies piled at the base of the fortifications, sometimes forming grisly ramps that later attackers climbed. Archaeological excavations of medieval siege sites occasionally reveal layers of bones clustered near former gates or walls, mute testimony to the cost of climbing first. Yet, unlike noble knights whose deaths were recorded, most of these men remained anonymous. Chroniclers focused on lords and leaders rarely noted the names of ordinary soldiers. Their sacrifice was absorbed into the faceless mass of casualties. Essential but unremembered, memory and storytelling. Societies remembered the first climbers in uneven ways. In Chanson's Digest, the epic poems of medieval France, heroes often scaled walls single-handedly, fighting entire garrisons at once. These exaggerated tales transformed grim reality into inspiring legend. In Islamic chronicles of the Crusades, the defenders' valor is emphasized just as much as the attackers' bravery. Stories praise those who hurled back the first climbers, casting them as guardians of faith and city. In both traditions, the latter was not simply a military tool. It was a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and divine favor or disfavor. Beyond Europe, echoes of the same pattern. The phenomenon was not unique to Western or Near Eastern warfare. In Japan's Sengoku era, the Ashigaru who scaled walls first were sometimes immortalized in clan records, their names tied to stipends granted to their families. In China, siege ladders were used in tandem with siege towers, but the principle remained. Some men had to climb first under fire, often carrying shields above their heads while arrows rained down. In all these societies, the same dynamic appeared: the need for sacrifice, the promise of reward, and the cultural memory that turned tragedy into honor. The practical decline of the siege ladder. Over time, the prominence of the ladder declined. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder artillery made it possible to batter walls with cannon, reducing the need for mass ladder assaults. Siege mines and sapping also offered alternatives, yet ladders never fully disappeared. Even in the age of cannon, assaults sometimes reverted to ladders when walls held firm. And the symbolic weight of being first over the wall persisted long into the gunpowder era. Surviving in military traditions and phrases, the ladder as metaphor, looking back, the siege ladder is more than an object of warfare. It represents the structure of medieval society itself. A few men bearing immense risk for the sake of the many. Honor and shame balancing alongside material reward. Sacrifice made necessary by circumstance. It also reveals the strange way societies transform. Suffering. What was, for most, a terrifying ordeal ending in violent death, became, in chronicles and songs, a story of valor. The latter is a reminder of how history remembers courage, but often forgets the cost. Reflection. Then and now, as you imagine Those men climbing into aerostorms centuries ago, it is tempting to dismiss their actions as distant and alien. Yet the logic persists. Even in modern times, soldiers are sent into situations where survival is slim, their role to draw fire so others can advance. The siege ladder, then, is not only a medieval relic. It is a symbol of how societies, across time, ask individuals to take the first step into danger for collective survival. The faces change, the weapons change, but the principle remains unsettlingly constant. And so the final question lingers. When standing before the wall, with the ladder in your hands and the eyes of your companions upon you, would you climb? And that brings us to the quiet end of tonight's story. I hope it helped you drift a little closer to rest, and reminded you how even the most overlooked pieces of history can carry weight. If you enjoyed this calm journey, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps us keep bringing you these slow, steady stories whenever you need them. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.